Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences Bioscience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, I was joined by three excellent guests. They are Thomas Meinzen, a recent Masters of Science graduate from Montana State University in Bozeman, Diane Debinski, who's a professor and department head in the Department of Ecology at MSU, and Laura Burkle, a professor also in the MSU Ecology Department. They were here to talk about something that most of us see every day but rarely think about, those narrow swaths of cleared land that are on the sides of roadways, and in particular, the way that those roadside habitats may be helpful or harmful for pollinating insects. Let's go to the interview. Thank you all very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Okay, great. So we're going to be talking today about roadside habitat, and in particular its relationship with pollinators. I think we're all familiar with occasionally seeing some wildflowers on the side of a highway or something like that. But if you could just tell us a little bit about what are these habitats like, and where do they exist, and those sorts of things.
So road bridges occur worldwide, just like roads. And they occur around roads primarily for safety purposes, to increase visibility for drivers. And also, if drivers run off the road, then they are not running instantly into trees or things like that. And so they're often kept free from larger vegetation, woody vegetation, and thus they tend to have a lot of grass, forbs, or wildflowers. So they can be really potentially attractive areas for pollinators. They vary in width and size depending upon the type of road. So often large highways have really wide road verges, and smaller roads tend to have less space. But they're often owned publicly, so by state transportation departments or counties, and they're not developed. So they're not planted with specific crops or paved over or anything like that. And thus, they can be reservoirs of plant diversity because they're not as tightly managed or developed as other areas in the surrounding landscape. And this can potentially make them valuable areas for pollinators. Okay,
and I'm wondering now about how pollinators fit into all of this. Of course, you have plants, you're likely to have pollinators, et cetera. But what's their relationship, sort of broadly speaking, like with these habitats?
Yeah, so roadsides are often host to quite a variety of pollinators, bees, butterflies, moths, beetles, flies as well. And they often come into the space looking for forage, so looking for food, nectar, and pollen. They may use it to reproduce as well, although that's not very well documented at this point. And then they may be moving along roadsides as well, because these are areas often that contain these long strips of flowers. They may be moving between areas along roadsides. That, again, is something that's been sort of widely talked about, but there's not that much evidence yet for that. So we still have a lot to learn about how pollinators use and move through roadside spaces.
So let's chat a little bit more about how these sorts of verges work for the pollinator species. Is it sort of an unalloyed good? I suspect not. In what ways do these affect pollinators? Are they do they struggle in these spaces? Are they going into them and getting stuck? What kinds of things are happening?
That's a great question, and that's kind of this big central focus of our paper, is trying to understand, by looking at all the literature that's out there, what are these spaces really doing for pollinators? We know that pollinators are using them, and in my work, I've been doing surveys along roadsides and finding a big diversity of bees and butterflies using these spaces, but we don't necessarily have a great understanding of how they're contributing to the population level impacts. So when a pollinator moves into one of these spaces, we don't know if their survivorship and their rate of reproduction is higher or lower than it would be in other landscapes. And that's a really important component, because if their survivorship and their reproduction rates are lower, then these verges might actually be a population sink. So they might actually be pulling pollinators in and causing them to have these lower vital rates, and thus having a negative impact on their populations. in general, though, we expect that they're coming in, they're foraging on flowers, and we hope that they are keeping to these road verges and not crossing the road because that's where the biggest mortality occurs. However, there's also other dangers in roadsides, particularly from mowing and herbicide spraying, which occurs really frequently in order to manage these areas to keep them clear, and also state mandates to control noxious weeds. So when a pollinator comes into a roadside, it's certainly entering a dangerous zone, and there might be a lot of reward in terms of available nectar and pollen and even nest sites, but it's not without its potential cost.
When pollinators use roadsides, they could be using the roadsides for a nectar source or pollen source. They could also be looking for a plant on which they would lay their eggs. So for butterflies, there are a lot of specific relationships between the butterfly species and the plant species. So, for example, one butterfly species might only lay its eggs on a violet, and another butterfly species might only lay its eggs on a milkweed. So the butterflies, as they come through these areas, could be nectaring on flowers and getting that resource, but they could also be searching for a place to lay an egg. And I could let Laura chime in about the bees. But so there are two different reasons for potentially an asset to a pollinator. And the two main things for butterflies would be a place to lay an egg if there's the appropriate plant, and then secondly, a place to collect some nectar.
Yeah, to elaborate on both of them, what Thomas and Diane was saying, one thing that struck me about what you said, Thomas, was that when they come into the roadside, and just to highlight, we don't even know if they're coming in from somewhere else always, or if they were born there, if they're using that space for their whole lives. And so that's something about use that we'd really like to know. For bees, the roadsides could be this nice open space, open ground where ground nesting bees could use, especially if the vegetation is really short. That could be a great place for ground nesting bees to lay their eggs in the ground. But not all bees are, use the ground for nesting. And so it wouldn't be a good place for, say, a wood nesting or a cavity nesting bee unless there's also trees in that area. It's pretty rare, especially along interstates. But bees are potentially using that space for both nesting and finding floral resources like nectar and pollen.
And is there any downside for, for instance, a bee to live in, sort of a narrow and long corridor of habitat rather than, what I would imagine, which is sort of a radius extending from a central location? Do we know anything about, how they do in those types of places?
Certainly, it would affect bees, and particularly some of the larger bees that have larger home ranges would be potentially detrimentally affected by only having this long corridor. Some of the bees in North America are very small and as a result have pretty small home ranges. And so there actually might be some that in the wider road verges, they could have a radial sort of habitat and still be within the road verge. Bigger ones like bumblebees would be traveling a lot farther. And of course, it would increase their energy use if they had to only travel in two directions instead of being able to go in radius, because they are these central place foragers going back and forth from a nest. Beyond that, I think a big concern as well is the chemical effects and the concerns about pollutants from traffic, heavy metals coming off of vehicles, also from the road surface, getting into the soil on the roadsides and potentially negatively impacting ground nesting bees. That's really been pretty understudied. And so right now we kind of have to act with precaution, I think, and we don't know too much about those concerns, but we do know that there's a lot of heavy metals and other elements that have been shown to affect bees negatively. Most of the studies have been with honeybees, and they are at pretty high concentrations in roadside soils, and so that is a concern. And as with many dangers along roadsides, that occurs in a gradient going out from the road surface. So right next to the road would be a really dangerous zone. And then as you get farther and farther, those chemicals and also the risks of collision should be decreasing. So as kind of connected to this, we really advise that if pollinator plantains are occurring, that they be occurring farthest from the road surface, so in the areas kind of closest to that fence line, rather than close by.
Right. And you mentioned vehicle strikes, and that was something that was, interesting to me because I don't typically think of roadkill as being anything other than, birds, squirrels, and the occasional deer. Is that a major source of mortality for pollinators that are in these areas?
It absolutely is, yeah. Certainly billions of insects killed every year, in much higher numbers than birds or squirrels. It's of course less obvious to us, but yeah, there's been quite a few studies on that, and the rates are pretty alarming. The studies do suggest that it's still a fraction of the total insects that might be using the roadsides, but it is a really high number. And in fact, it's kind of interesting that some of the more reliable potentially data we have are just based on collecting insects off of vehicles and noticing that now there are far fewer insects being hit by vehicles than there used to be, which is kind of a crazy metric for paying attention to insect population decline, but kind of illuminates how little we know about insects and their populations in general, that we are using such coarse methods as what piles up on a grill and a windshield. But it is something that's people are really noticing. I've heard stories about people like, oh yeah, I used to be driving and there's my windshield be covered with insects, and now there's very few. And that's not because insects are no longer getting hit. It's rather because there are fewer insects to be hit.
And I'm wondering also about you mentioned herbicides. Does road salt play a role as well? We recently ran a feature about road salt, so it's sort of on my mind.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, and that's a really interesting one because sodium has really complex role in the development of invertebrate bodies. So there's been some interesting studies on the impacts of road salt with monarch butterflies specifically. And they found that slightly higher sodium concentrations can actually have potential positive physiological benefits for monarchs. For females, I think they can produce larger eyes and potentially larger wing muscles. But at higher levels, of course, it's toxic. And in many cases where road salt is being applied in winter, the soil and potentially the plants as well growing along the roadsides actually would be at toxic levels. There's also been a study that's found that monarchs aren't able to detect that when they're laying their eggs, so they could be laying their eggs on milkweed plants that are actually toxic to the caterpillars. So that's one good reason to keep a clear zone, really short mown area right next to the roadside, so that really toxic zone doesn't have plants growing in it, that it's going to be attractive to the bees and butterflies.
I was hoping you could talk just a little bit about, we've mentioned some of the potentially troublesome aspects of roadside habitats, and I want to get into, the potential maybe for them to be, sort of corridors, et cetera, in a little bit. But I wanted to explore the idea of a potential ecological trap. It's mentioned in the article, and it was something that I found interesting. So can you tell us a little bit about what that means in this context?
Yeah, absolutely. So an ecological trap is an area that might be attractive to organism, either could be for various reasons, but it looks like good habitat to them. But in fact, in that habitat, their survivorship or their reproduction rates or both are lower than they would be in other habitats, and they're lower than replacement. So basically, if you imagine say in this case bees are coming into roadsides, They have plenty of flowers, so they look good. So they pull in immigrants from the rest of the area into these roadside habitats. But then the bees that are there are either being killed, maybe by traffic, at higher rates, or when they lay their eggs aren't hatching, or they are getting killed by mowers. There could be various reasons for those rates to decline, but if they aren't surviving and reproducing above sort of replacing the parents, then actually they're pulling from that population and they're leading to a decline in the whole population. So it might be good for certain individual bees who find lots of forage, but on a population level, it's actually causing the population to decline. There can be some really complicated metapopulation dynamics with ecological traps, but the idea is that it might be attractive to the animal, but actually disadvantage them. And so that's a big concern because, of course, we don't want to be planting flowers and increasing sort of the number of immigrants of pollinators into roadsides if they are, in fact, an ecological trap.
I guess I'll just say that it depends a lot on what is nearby, right? So if you imagine the roadside as being this really flowery, wonderful looking place, how it appears to a pollinator is going to really depend on what's on the other side of that fence line. If it's a big potato field in Idaho or something where Thomas was working, that roadside might look wonderful. But if on the other side of that fence line is a natural sagebrush habitat, then they might not be as likely to get lured into one of these roadside plantings or areas.
Right, and I want to talk about that, habitat corridor question in a moment. But before we do, I think you raised something that interests me, which is, how is this studied? What kind of methods do you do? How much of this is in the field? Are you in a position where you're forced to draw together material from a lot of disparate fields? How does an article like this one kind of come together? What sorts of sources? What sorts of field work? How does it all happen?
Yeah, so this is a review article, so it's really based on the work of honestly hundreds of other scientists that have been trying to answer these questions and work in this field for a long time. And particularly in recent years, there's just been a lot of attention to roadsides and to pollinators. So it's an exciting time to be in this field and to be learning about the research that's coming out. For my master's, I was working in the field in Idaho, doing roadside surveys for bees and butterflies and plants. And that helped me get a lot of sort of on the ground context, as well as working with the Department of Transportation there to kind of understand the challenges that they face and hopefully tailor the recommendations that we gave in our paper to be things that will be useful and practical to these managers. I think sometimes it can be easy to get out there and see, this should just be done this way. But then when you look at the challenges and the mandates that these managers are under and facing, then it gets more complicated for sure. One example of this is that people who are actually doing the roadside management, like mowing and spraying, that's for the most part, that's their entire job. And so to say, don't mow, don't spray, kind of goes against their sort of what they're paid to do and what they came into their job to do. And so I think it's important that a lot of these sort of ideas that scientists are finding are actually trickling down to the people who are on the ground doing the management. And I hope that with this paper, we could synthesize a lot of the different research that's going on in this area and then provide some useful and practical application of it, thinking about, okay, if I'm a manager of these habitats, what should I be doing given what we know now, especially given the fact that there's a lot of questions that are still out there.
I just wanted to follow up to say the review process for this paper helped add additional dimensions that we had not covered as well as we thought we had at the beginning. So one of the reviewers suggested that we think about this from more of an international perspective. And so the three of us are from the US and have spent most of our time in the US, and we envision roadsides and think about them from that perspective. But one of the reviewers said, in some countries, people plant crops in roadsides, or in other countries, there might be a lot of trees in the roadsides. So we did step back from the first version of the paper and try to incorporate more international perspectives so that the commentary that we were making had a broader set of applicability internationally. And so that was helpful for us, but also in terms of thinking about what are roadsides and what are road verges and how do people manage them and what actually occurs in them. It was helpful to take that step back and think about it from a broader perspective.
Yeah, I think that raises an interesting question, which is, at what level and by whom, are the decisions about, roadside habitat management made? I think that most of us who are driving past are simply seeing, folks in high-vis vests with potentially mowers or weed eaters and things like that. But, who's actually making the call on, what happens, what areas are cleared, how frequently they're mown, things like that?
Well, that certainly varies by country. And so
Sure.
mentioned we're all in the United States, and so couldn't speak to that very well in other countries. But here in the U.S., most of the decision making happens at the state level by state departments of transportation, or DOTs. However, the federal government does have an impact in Congress in terms of the funding that's available. So, as an example, the infrastructure bill was passed in 2021, had millions of dollars set aside for expanding pollinator habitat in roadsides and rights of way. And so those funds, affect who can be hired at the state level and what kinds of work they can do. And of course, there also are federal mandates, particularly with the interstate program, for how those should be managed. But most of the decision making happens at the state level within these DOTs.
And I would say a follow-up is that it can even vary significantly among counties within a state how the roadsides are managed. And in living in the Midwest, there's a roadside manager for every single county in Iowa. There are 99 counties. And particular roadside managers might be really interested in prairie restoration. And what I saw was that there were particular counties that people had taken the initiative to try to reseed these roadsides to prairie habitat and prairie vegetation. So it was highly variable based upon the funding and the individuals involved and the priorities in those local areas, how roadsides could be managed.
And I'd add to that too, that specifically the state DOTs manage more of the highways, and then the smaller roads are more county managed, and it would vary by state too. And an example, we worked with someone in Idaho who was really enthusiastic about pollinators in the state transportation department, which is part of the reason why we were able to do all this work. And it's huge. So it does, often come down to individuals who are enthusiastic about pollinators. And so we want to, recognize and uplift those individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's chat a little bit about, what those individuals might be able to create in terms of advantages for pollinators, sustaining the health of populations, providing habitat corridors. What's the sort of, best case scenario? What can you get out of a, really well-managed roadside verge?
Yeah. Well, ideally, you can have a verge where those kind of dangers to pollinators are minimized, and potentially the rewards might be maximized. But I think that at this point, because we don't know that much about to what extent roadsides are an ecological trap, it's actually more important that we focus on minimizing the dangers. So rather than trying to bring in more pollinators to roadsides, we want to think about how to make those roadsides that already contain a lot of pollinators safer for them. So management has a big role in that. We encourage, for example, mowing to not occur during the summer and not during the growing season when pollinators are going to be most active out there using it, but rather trying to mow very early or late in the season, and generally as little as possible, Also, herbicide use. Right now, there's just a ton of herbicide use in roadsides in most areas. And in general, there's probably more than there needs to be for the management to occur. So we encourage spot treating, so just specifically spraying noxious weeds rather than doing any kind of blanket spraying. And again, trying to do that early while weeds are still at their rosette stage before they have flowers. Another component that's important is trying to maintain a clear zone, and that really overlaps with the safety mandate for a lot of DOTs. So maintain this zone right next to the pavement, really short, so it doesn't attract pollinators into that kind of high danger area, and then leave the area that's closer to the fence line, farther from the road surface, let that go longer. So you're encouraging pollinators to use areas that are farther from the road. There's been a little bit of potential interesting results suggesting, including actually some what Diane's worked on in Iowa, suggesting that better habitat along roadsides, more diverse flowers might encourage pollinators not to leave those roadsides and cross the road. So that's really encouraging. I think that question needs to be pursued with more studies, but ideally, if we can have good quality native diverse plantings at the far edge from the road surface, then we can encourage pollinators to use that habitat and stay away from the dangerous road area.
Okay, great. So I guess my last or nearly last question might be something along the lines of, what's next for this research? And if not, your personal research, what would you like to see done? What are the areas of, most upcoming interest and, concern and potential?
Yeah, I think getting back to the question of what happens in the roadsides from the perspective of birth and death of particular species of pollinators is really a key. And it would be very difficult to look at the whole community of butterflies or the whole community of bees living in a roadside. So it would be best to focus on a few individual species for which we could get lots of data and look at the reproduction that happens in the roadsides and compare that to what's happening in a similar kind of vegetation community that's not a roadside. And then also looking at the mortality rates. So to be able to better quantify reproduction and mortality for a subset of the species of, say, butterflies and bees in roadsides compared to similar habitat that's a similar size, a similar composition of vegetation that's not a roadside. So it could be potentially a buffer zone along a creek or a river. It could be a little habitat patch that's linear that has a similar kind of vegetation community. And sometimes it's hard to find these things on the landscape, but I think we have the potential to even design them and create our own landscape designs to test these kinds of hypotheses.
To add on to that, I think it's really interesting to get at use versus benefit, and Thomas really highlighted this in the paper. So I think we're also really interested in movement. So there's some cool techniques you can use, at least for bees, that are called window pane traps. And so you can, it's like a clear window that you can orient in different directions and see which insects are heading in which directions. Are they crossing the road? Are they coming from somewhere else versus emerging at a particular place, like within the roadside? So that's one technique. You could also use something called emergence traps. So placing these little tents over the ground, and you can see which bees are using the ground in a roadside versus land just adjacent to the roadside that's not part of that area, and see where bees are nesting. That wouldn't work as well for butterflies. But to add on to what Diane was saying, like in addition to reproduction, birth and death, thinking about movement and use of these places versus whether or not they're reproducing there, benefiting compared to nearby areas.
I would also add one more piece that I'm really interested in is trying to assess how roadside habitat restoration, like including plantings, affects the rate of collision mortality on roads. So if you do a nice pollinator planting along the side of a road, is there more or less rate of collision before and after? So that's a challenging thing to answer, but I think it's really important given that there's millions of dollars now earmarked for roadside pollinator restoration. We want to know, should that be spent on plantings, or if we plant, are there going to be higher levels of collision? And so actually, we should focus all of that just on, education, and particularly changing the way that we mow and spray roadsides. So that's one more question that I would love to investigate and hope that other scientists do as well.
Great. That's fascinating. And I think this is an area to which we should all stay tuned as long as we can. Thank you very much for joining me today. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that concludes this episode of Bioscience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal Bioscience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.